Nexus PMG welcomes you to the Bigger Than Us podcast, which we as energy geeks lovingly refer to as the BTU. Bigger Than Us is a podcast that focuses on ideas that will shape the future of our planet and ultimately our existence. We will occasionally lean into energy topics because, after all, it's the key to our collective survival. But we'll also explore other ideas and topics that we believe will have an impact that is bigger than us. And now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Maxine Bédat to the show. Maxine Bédat is the founder and director of the New Standard Institute, a research and action think tank using data to drive accountability in the fashion industry. Prior to NSI, Maxine co-founded and was the CEO of Zadie, a fashion brand and lifestyle destination creating a transparent and sustainable future for the apparel industry. For its work in sustainability, Zadie was named one of the world's most innovative companies in retail by Fast Company. Bédat has been recognized by Oprah in her Super Soul 100 for leaders elevating humanity and serves as an ambassador for Rainforest Alliance. Maxine, how are you doing today?
I am doing okay. We're in this COVID world, and I can say it's we're surviving.
And where exactly in the COVID world are you?
I am based in Brooklyn, New York.
And how's the weather up there today?
You know what? It has been a very mild winter, which doesn't say great things about global warming, but has been a gift for at least being outdoors with other people.
You're right, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yes.
So, Maxine, I like to open this show by asking my guest the following question. If you were asked to share something interesting about yourself, what would it be?
Oh, goodness. I used to be a ballroom dancer. That seems to be something a bit out of the ordinary. It's my path to what I'm doing now has been long and winding, and yes, it included a stop as a ballroom dancer.
What kind of dance?
Well, ballroom dancing, I did the standard dances, so waltz, tango, foxtrot, Viennese waltz, and quickstep.
Do you have a favorite?
It really depended, and still does, I suppose, on my mood. So if I generally liked the foxtrot, but if I was feeling a bit feisty, then the tango was good too.
You know that scene from Scent of a Woman?
I don't know. Is that bad?
No, there's a wonderful scene with Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman. There's a great tango scene from that movie.
Oh, yes, I can visualize it now. Yes, I think the standard tango is a bit different than the Argentine tango, but yes, there's got a lot of romance and excitement in that dance.
Very emotional.
Yes.
So you mentioned global warming. Can you give the audience an overview of the New Standard Institute and your role at the organization?
Sure. So the New Standard Institute is a think and do tank that is focused on moving industry, focusing specifically on the fashion industry, to hold it accountable with regard to the industry's environmental and social impact. So what we do is, at the moment, sustainability, especially in the fashion industry, is a very vague, wishy-washy term that has come to mean just about anything and nothing. And so what the New Standard Institute does is bring together the existing data that we have available on what the actual impacts of the industry are, to kind of serve as a clearinghouse of information for others, whether it be organizations or media or brands themselves, to know what the industry's impact is, and to use that data then to drive systems change within the fashion industry.
I love the think and do tank. How do you collect the data?
So basically what we have done is we have looked through first starting with peer-reviewed journals. And what is interesting about fashion is that it encompasses so many kind of what are traditionally siloed topics. So whether it's climate change or agriculture issues or water issues, which would include things like microplastic pollution, but also chemistry and chemical impact, labor issues as well. And so we've kind of done a deep dive across all of these different impact area categories and examined what data is available in the literature, and then what is available from other organizations in the space. And then finally, we've actually gone out and traveled to the supply chain so that we have a network of whether it's farmers or mill executives, mill workers, garment executives, and brands themselves. So we have a full network and understanding of what is happening, both from a kind of academic point of view, but also from real world on the ground as well.
So you mentioned microplastic. Can you tell us what's the relationship between fashion and microplastics?
Yes. So first of all, just to kind of start out in thinking about microplastics, we have to think about the macroplastics, because I think when people consider plastic pollution, they imagine the things that they can see. They think about that water bottle bobbing up and down in the water, or the garbage patch. But the majority of the plastic pollution that is out there is actually these microplastics, these things that you cannot see except for under a microscope. And within the microplastic pollution, textiles is actually 34.8% of all microplastics. So it's a huge driver of plastic pollution and microplastic pollution in particular. And that is because there has been an enormous shift in the past 20 years away from natural fibers to synthetic fibers, which are plastic-based. So the primary one is polyester. And polyester today, which is again a plastic that is created from a fossil fuel, is in the majority of clothing. And that is, when you kind of chart the graph of that, just an astronomical rise and a dramatic shift from the world we had before, where fibers came from the ground, either a cotton plant or flax plant, to something that is fossil fuel derived. And it's happened within a generation.
So you mentioned generation. When did the change happen? Ballpark, and why did it happen?
Well, if you chart the rise of polyester and you chart the rise of fast fashion companies like H&M, Zara, and these even faster fashion companies that are coming up, it matches pretty closely. And the polyester is a cheaper fiber. So when you are creating a business that is dependent on producing cheap clothes, you use the cheapest fiber. And so it's really been this move to seeing clothing as disposable and these business models of disposability that have aligned very closely with the dramatic rise of polyester, these plastic-based fibers.
You mentioned, I think, H&M, and most recently, my older daughter, she was looking at a website named Shein, and she was telling me the prices of some of the clothes that are on that website. $7 for a top. How does a company manage to get that produced and sent all the way to America for $7?
Yeah, well, it means they're cutting corners wherever they possibly can. And so that is twofold. You go do your production in a country that has the lowest environmental standards, and you go to a country that has the lowest labor standards. And the fashion industry is, I think, an interesting one to study because, at least on the cut and sew side, the way we produce clothing hasn't changed. What we've made it out of has changed, but how we've produced our clothing hasn't changed in the past about 100 years. It's still produced primarily by women sitting at sewing machines. And so it's those businesses are pretty easy to set up because it only requires a sewing machine, which is not expensive. And so what the fashion industry has done has started this race to the bottom that pit countries against one another of who can have the lowest standards. And this is how you get a top that costs $5 or $7, is that you are using the very cheapest material. You are not implementing environmental regulations. So chemicals are, being used and not being filtered out and entering the water supply. And you are certainly not paying your workers anywhere close to a living wage.
There's a lot of talk in the environmental movement about externalities. And I feel like as you were talking, I'm just thinking of the pollution you mentioned or the low wages, the other externalities that people and the planet is being forced to bear. And again, we can't see it, we're on the consuming end, but maybe it's a more philosophical question. But, how do we turn this back? How do we stop this? And obviously education is one of the pathways to do so. But if you had the power to do so, how would you prevent this or stop this or slow it down from happening?
Well, I think it's beyond a philosophical conversation. It's a regulatory conversation. We create the rules in which these businesses operate, and we can change them. And so we can insist that companies that are importing product into the United States and having access to our markets, that they are produced in certain ways. In fact, we already have laws on the books for things like products that are produced with modern day slavery. So technically, it's illegal to import a product produced by modern day slavery. It's just unfortunate that there's not a lot of resources in that department in the United States to ensure that that rule is actually implemented. So it's really a matter of regulatory shifts ultimately. And we have the ability to change these regulations. I think as a starting point, however, what we can do is demand as people who consume these products, is demand that the brands are actually disclosing what is happening in their supply chain. So disclosing what their environmental and social footprint is, and setting public targets for what they are going to do to achieve reductions of those impacts. So it can, ultimately, I think these are regulatory issues where it's just the rules of doing business. But as a starting point, we can really make our voices heard with brands directly by insisting and demanding that they be transparent and disclose what their impacts are and where they're going.
So speaking of transparency, can you share with the audience what shadow factories are?
Sure. So shadow factories, it's basically this concept that, so I have to back up a little bit, which is that in the early 90s, as kind of globalization was really going, at full speed. Actually, let me back up one more step
Sure.
to talk about why we have this phenomenon now. Is that in the 1960s in the United States, if you were wearing clothing, you were likely wearing clothing, one would hope. The clothing that one was wearing was likely made in the United States. So something like 95% of the clothing that Americans wore was American made. And globalization opened the world up, and there was many, benefits of that. But what happened is the clothing very quickly started getting produced in other countries that were cheaper, primarily cheaper labor. And, we talked about this kind of race to the bottom. That race kind of started to take off. And so today, I think 98% of clothing that Americans wore are not made in the United States. So a complete reversal from the 1960s. So in this kind of race to the bottom in the 90s, what was uncovered by the media were the kind of unsavory, the downsides of this globalized supply chain were these sweatshops. So Nike got in big trouble for it, and there were 60-minute programs, and people began to realize this very unsavory process behind how we were getting our clothing. And from that, what happened is brands started to develop these codes of conduct for their the factories that they worked with. And basically it was, saying you have to have, chemistry management and certain labor standards. And this is what they then started to ask of their suppliers. But at the same time, they kept asking for price reductions from their suppliers. So it was asking for high standards, but then not really putting their own money where their mouth was. And so now what has happened is there's an entire kind of auditing regime around ensuring that these standards are being implemented, or at least providing cover for the brands that they are attempting to implement. And to skirt around this auditing regime, factories have used what is called shadow factories, which are not audited facilities most often, which then have, lower standards. And you can't find good numbers around, how many shadow factories there are, because the whole reason they exist is because they are meant to not be seen. But I think it's important to note, it is so often, the brands will say like, oh, our suppliers they are breaking the rules. But it is important to note the price pressure and the very small margins that the factories are already operating under, and how those two things, if you want to keep reducing your prices that you're giving to factories, eventually they're going to have to break rules. So that's a long
no, I appreciate you sharing that and the history too. So if you were to, let's say, suggest or recommend people become more thoughtful regarding their consumption habits, what would you suggest from a step-by-step process, or something that you could say to a person, here, try this instead?
Well, I think in order to answer that question, I think I would answer it in two ways. One is I would spend some time in my closet actually looking at the tags. What are things actually made out of? Getting a better understanding of what one actually really likes. Because I think, I've spoken to a lot of women in particular, but men too, who actually don't know what they really like in clothing. And that actually leaves them far more open to kind of these trends, our marketing messages, is because they don't actually know what makes them happy and what gives them actual true pleasure. So I think, from a personal standpoint, starting there and looking at tags and seeing, well, what actually feels good. There is something, the statistic is that women wear only about 20% of what's in their closet. So why would you spend money on something that you're never going to actually wear? And what are those 20%? I think if we can start from that standpoint and really figure out what we love, we're going to end up enjoying what we buy, first of all, and wearing our things more, which is ultimately the biggest driver in terms of personal purchasing decisions, is actually wearing our garments longer. That is really what needs to be the driving point of our own individual purchasing practices. But beyond just individual purchasing practices, I think what's critical for people to know is that they have a voice both in the purchases that they make, but also in what they are demanding of brands, and that getting in the habit of asking a company that they might support, what are they doing with their supply chain? Those questions, trickle up to the executives, and that's how change begins to happen. And so I think that, individuals who are hearing the impacts of the industry and want to do something, it's both what can they do in their individual purchasing decisions, but also the role that they play in communicating with brands what they expect of them. And then I would just add the exposure. We have vastly increased our exposure to advertising content. And so a very practical thing, I think, about habit formation, a very practical thing to do is, whether it's on Instagram or your email, is unfollowing or unsubscribing to brands and retailers so that you're less exposed to these marketing messages all of the time.
We just rolled through Black Friday and we're coming up on Christmas, so
And
I think
I think we're seeing now that people are having more conversations about, maybe especially now because of COVID and being stuck in one's home, and kind of being forced to live with all of the stuff that one has acquired. That we can still, we can gift services. There's so many, other important gifts that you can have besides, a pair of slippers that you'll never actually wear.
true. So, have you done the closet exercise yourself? And if you have, what did you learn?
I have done that. That's kind of how I got started. My closet was overflowing, and I felt like I was always buying things, and yet I never had anything to wear. And I got very frustrated one day, and so I decided to go through my whole closet and did that exact exercise. And what I found made me feel much better because the things that I really loved were natural fibers. They actually feel much better than polyester does most of the time. And so I found that the things that I tended to wear on repeat would be, a nice, especially during COVID, a nice cotton t-shirt, maybe a cashmere cardigan, a layering piece. And kind of knowing my own lifestyle, I could then think about the next purchase. If I did it actually make sense with my lifestyle, or were the, high heels that I was buying, I didn't actually end up using them because, like, how often did I actually need, patent leather high heels? Not often.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a Marie Kondo moment.
Yeah. And I think, Marie Kondo in that regard is, that whole movement is great. I would add one additional step, which is actually another Japanese concept, not by KonMari, which is acknowledging, a regret for the resources used as one gives things away. Because what we hear when we speak to the donation centers is they are just getting inundated from all of this purging that's going on. And purging is okay, but if it's just to refill your closet again and keep that cycle going, that actually isn't moving the needle very much. So I think a recognition of the resources that were used as we, limit our things to what sparks joy will be an important additional step in that KonMari method.
I agree. So, coming back to the Institute for a moment, who's your customer or your client?
Yeah, so it's broad, and we really think about the stakeholders of fashion, and those are our audience. So the stakeholders are the citizens, stakeholders are the media, and stakeholders are the brands themselves. And so on the New Standard Institute, and through our social media channels in particular, which we are at NSI Fashion 2030, I should note, that we provide guidance for all of those stakeholders, what one can do as a citizen, what one can do as a brand, and what one can, how media can responsibly cover this industry. So we really think about the entire fashion system and think about systems change as opposed to kind of just one area.
I like that. So, changing gears, let's get to the crux of our conversation is the why behind what you do. You mentioned your experiment with your own closet, but what drove you to get involved? What drove you to start this? What's your driving force? What motivates you?
Well, I think if I really am honest with myself, I, at an early age, was exposed to a lot of injustice, not of mine, but my family comes from South Africa, and so I saw. I was born in the United States, but I saw apartheid, and as a young person, I I couldn't even equate like how that could be a world that would exist. And so I think if I'm thinking about what has driven me, it's that certainly a sense of wanting the world to be a just world. And but I think kind of more concretely, beyond that broader drive, is I did not start in the fashion industry. I got my start working at the United Nations, and I'm a lawyer by training. But what I found is that the work that the UN was focused on in terms of the Millennial Development Goals, which became the Sustainable Development Goals, that they all tied to how our products are made, sold, how much people are getting paid, what impact do those products have, and where do they go when we're done with them. And so fashion seemed to me a very powerful way in addressing what seem like such separate siloed issues, but in reality they are all embodied in our clothing. And so that was how I got started in the path, first launching a fashion company that was focused on sustainability, and then deciding to focus instead on not on producing more garments, but on informing and educating the industry and industry stakeholders. So it's from a deep-seated desire for a just world, and then seeing that fashion plays just a massively powerful and underreported role in the planet that we live on and its potential for its future.
I want to underline that piece about underreported. It's something that we rarely think about. We just take clothing for granted. We don't really put a concern into where it comes from. I've actually had the pleasure of being overseas and seeing some of the manufacturing plants both in India and in Vietnam, and experiencing, you mentioned, we talked about shadow factories, but seeing how things are made. And also, interestingly enough, seeing how clothing is made in factories, and the same clothing might be shipped, for example, to, let's say, a Dillard's here, and the same clothing ends up in the marketplaces in these cities for significantly less amount of money. But just the disparities in what we quote unquote buy here and pay here versus what the clothing is actually worth in those countries.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's clothing. If you think about trade, even from the very beginning, it was the Silk Road, which was about textiles. The trade links that we have globally around the world have all, direct links back to our clothing. I mean, if you think about India and India's cotton, and it was the drive for that cotton in India at first that drove colonialism and drove modern day capitalism. And I think clothing is so often dismissed as this silly, girly, inconsequential thing. And even in the environmental circles, I'll raise the topic of clothing, which, depending on which report you believe, has anywhere between 4 and 8% of total climate impact globally. So it's this massively impactful industry. No matter how you cut it, but it's seen as something girly and inconsequential, and it certainly is not.
Absolutely not. So, what are some of the most valuable lessons you've learned on your journey so far?
Oh, there's so many. I think, to me, I think it's important, if we really, two things, I guess. If we're really looking to address these big environmental and social issues, we have to be driven by the data. And that's the only way we're really going to see whether we're making any progress. Because narrative can be so powerful and is so powerful. Stories are so powerful and important. But they can distract us, or they can be misleading in that we think change is being made, when it's really just change on the margin. And so I think we really need to focus in on that data, to know, whether we are actually moving the needle in a significant way. And then I also think that, and I think we're seeing more and more of this, that we need to understand the world in systems, because it's also, the way to drive change is to see how these things are all interconnected. And that's been a very powerful lens for me, is to kind of, mapping out, who are the different stakeholders, within fashion, or where are the various impacts, and bringing all of those things to bear is how we can really drive change, and then using data, achieve those meaningful shifts.
I love the idea of taking a holistic view. So let's change our view for a moment here. It's 2030, like you mentioned in your handle earlier. What does the future hold? Magic wand, the new Standard Institute in 2030, what does it look like?
Well, if we've achieved what we've set out to achieve, NSI, and that's why we've put NSI Fashion 2030 as our handle, won't need to exist anymore. And I do think that is important, because I think sometimes organizationally, we may get distracted in, trying to perpetuate our own existence. But, I'm trying to get myself out of a job by 2030. And so, what it looks like is we've all taken a look at our system of clothing, which I think does a terrific job of helping us understand the other areas of environmental and social impact. We understand through our clothing, how labor is driven down globally. Through our clothing, we understand agricultural practices. We understand ocean pollution and environmental pollution more broadly. And we understand climate impact and kind of what drives it, and how it's global too. That we can't just have policies in the US to drive down our energy use, all while just offshoring and outsourcing the climate impact to other countries. So we've kind of all taken a study of that. We realize it's actually not rocket science to change these things. And it's all a matter of just having our voices be heard, and getting these policies implemented, that we all see that we have a serious stake, and that being a citizen means something. And we've used that citizenship to change policy, to have rules that, are truly democratic and work for us. And from that, we've built societies and trade relationships that aren't a race to the bottom, but are a race to the top, where we have good jobs that pay a living wage, whether it's in the United States or around the world, that we have oceans that are filled with fish and not plastic, that our air is clean and doesn't cause disease to breathe, and that we've addressed our climate impact and live in a thriving planet. And I think that world is a much more joyous world, where we have the time to connect, which is what, when you read the literature on happiness, the literature does not say that buying stuff makes us happy. The literature all says that having meaning and connection is the thing that truly makes us happy. So that would be my vision for 2030.
I love the idea of a race to the top. As you were speaking, there's a quote that came to mind: the things you own end up owning you.
Yes, absolutely.
So, last question. If you could share some advice or words of wisdom, and you've already peppered the conversation with some, so advice or words of wisdom with the audience, what would it be?
I think if I could say one thing, it's that we all hold so much more power than we think that we have. And whether you are just starting out, if you're a student, you can determine, the path that your career takes, or if you are working at a company and you feel like, well, I'm not senior management, I don't have any sway. Asking the questions is what creates the change. And so I think if I would have one thing to say, it's that you have more power power as a citizen, power as a worker, and asking those questions, signing on to petitions makes a difference. And if you look at history, which I've had the benefit of being able to study, you can see that any change that has happened in the past has been from, a few voices speaking up. And so I think if we all see the power that we truly have, we can make these changes, which are not rocket science. It's just a matter of creating that political will.
You have power. I think this is a great place to end. But Maxine, before we go, can you speak briefly to the petition you mentioned?
Yes. So what we have at New Standard Institute, which you can find at newstandardinstitute.org, is a petition that anyone can sign on, and we would love and encourage that. And it's basically to demand that the largest fashion companies that have the largest environmental and social footprint do something that is pretty straightforward. It's doing a social and environmental accounting of their impact, to actually publish that impact, disclose that impact, and to disclose the targets that the companies have set for themselves of how they are going to reduce that impact and what they are doing right now to achieve those targets. What we have found is that because there has been growing concern from citizens, from all of us, brands have come forward and have set targets for things like 2030 or 2050. But what we're finding, just like what we found for targets that were set for 2020, that a target in and of itself doesn't mean it's going to be fulfilled magically. And we saw in 2020 that companies had set targets for themselves that they never ended up achieving. And so what this petition is to have your voice heard with those brands, so that they see that we care, that we don't just want words, that we want to see action. And so that is what is the petition. And we would really love your listeners, if they care to make an impact, to go on to newstandardinstitute.org and sign on.
I will put a link to it in the show notes, Maxine. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Likewise.
Before we go, I'm excited to share that we've launched our comic strip, The Adventures of Mira and Nexie. You can find the first issue at our website, nexuspmg.com, under the Original Content tab. Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. And you can show your support by sharing our show with a friend, or reach out to us on social media, where you'll find us under our Nexus PMG handle. If there's a subject or topic you'd like to hear about, send me an email, btu@nexuspmg.com, or contact me via our website, nexuspmg.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, where we share what we're reading and thinking about in the clean tech, green tech sectors. Bigger Than Us is a Nexus PMG production.